All right, good afternoon and welcome to our final webinar for Preservation Month. We're really excited to have you all here this afternoon with us to talk about the Michigan State Historic Tax Credit. This has been an issue that we as an organization have, and as you as constituents and preservation professionals and those passionate about preservation, commercial development, homeowners have been advocating for several years now. So we wanted to take a moment and provide an update about where it is in the process, how is it currently looking as it is written in the bills before our state legislators, and to talk about what you guys can do to help us move this forward and get the state tax credit back to Michigan. It is an important economic stimulus tool, which in this climate is so important, and we're really looking forward to talking with you about this further. Slide. Many of you are getting very familiar with Zoom software. That is what we are using today for this webinar. If you have a question during the presentation, do type that into the Q&A box. If you wiggle your mouse, there should be a toolbar that pops up. Usually it's from the bottom, and there will be a Q&A with two little chat boxes, or what is it, talk bubbles, that you can click on and type your question in. We will be saving questions till the end, but feel free to type them in as you think about them. If you type it into the chat, there's concern that we'll forget about it or we won't see it. So please make sure to type in your questions into that Q&A box. Chat is active. You can talk to us as panelists, and we will use it to provide links if needed throughout the presentation. We will have polls today because we want to know more about you and kind of where your interest is in the tax credit. So do participate when those pop up. And finally, the webinar is being recorded, and we will be providing a link to the recording sometime early next week. So you can share it with those who are unable to join us, or if you were unable to join us live, people will be able to view it later. All right, next slide. All right, so today our webinar is titled The Michigan Historic Tax Credit. Will it pass and how does it work? And today we are joined by Mark Rodman, Michigan Historic Preservation Network's Executive Director, and we're really looking forward to having him provide this update. Next slide. And if you are joining us for the first time and you're unfamiliar with our organization, the Michigan Historic Preservation Network advocates for Michigan's historic places to contribute to our economic vitality, sense of place, and connection to the past. We are the statewide nonprofit organization, and we are a membership-driven organization. So if you are a current member, thank you so much for supporting the work that we do. If you are not a member, I would recommend checking out our website and finding out more and seeing if you would like to be a part of our efforts. Our website is www.mhpn.org. Slide. And these webinar series that you have seen starting in April, and they will go through the end of September. This webinar series is supported by the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs. So we thank them so much for their support today. All right, and without further ado, I will turn it over to Mark because we have a lot to get through today.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm always excited to talk about the tax credit. We're very hopeful that we can get something done in this session. And I know for all you guys in Michigan, it's been a long, wild ride to try to get this historic preservation tax credit back. I will mention something first. Mallory was talking about, this is Preservation Month, and I don't know if you can really see it or not, but the poster that's behind me is from Colorado, where I came from, and it's their first Preservation Month poster, but actually in 1990, they called it in Colorado Archaeology Week, and then it got expanded as the nation kind of took over and started doing Preservation Month. So if you can see it, that's the first Preservation Month poster from Colorado. So glad to have that and always happy to celebrate Preservation Month. So what I want to do first to kind of get an idea of what the audience is like before we get into the meat of this thing is to ask you guys a few questions. So we have some polls that we're going to put up just to kind of find out who you are. And the first poll is talk about who you represent. Now, there's going to be a list of things you can choose from, and you may represent all kind of different things, but pick one that best describes you so we kind of get an idea of what our audience is today. All right, so everybody had a chance to select?
We're at about 50%, so we'll give everybody just a few more seconds.
Okay. There's probably some of those folks out there that thought, I didn't know this was going to be participatory.
All right, so we're at about 66%. And so we'll end this poll and we'll share it with participants.
Okay, so we have a sort of a nice mix, mostly local governments and preservation nonprofit folks. So it's a good idea to know that you guys are here and also know that we have representatives from other groups here as well. So thank you again for joining us. The next question that I have is, have any of you that are joining the webinar used the tax credit when it was active before between 1999 and 2011? Did you take advantage of the tax credit for a project?
All right, so we're at about 73% who's voted.
Okay.
So we'll end this poll now.
Okay, so some of you have, about a third of you, and then some of you have not. So we're hoping this will give you a tool if we can get this thing passed that you can use and take advantage of. Thanks. All right, the next thing that I want to mention is that we have a website, www.miimpact.com, that has all the information about the tax credit and what we're trying to do. I want to get an idea of how many of you guys have visited that website and seen the information that is there.
Yeah, some people have been saying in the chat that they forgot to hit submit or didn't realize they had to hit submit. So no worries. We appreciate you being here. So if you missed an earlier question, that's all right. So we're at about 77% who's voted. So we can end this poll. And we're about a 50-50 split.
Okay, great. Well, some people we can direct there and they can learn a little bit more about the tax credit after the seminar. So that's great. All right, and then the next to the last question that I have is Michigan Historic Preservation Network in the winter sponsors a advocacy day at the state capitol to come and talk about issues that are important to historic preservation with our legislators. Obviously in 2019 and 2020, the big subject was the historic preservation tax credit, and we just barely got the advocacy day in this week before the shutdown, but we were able to do that and had a lot of good conversations with our legislators. I want to get an idea of how many people on this call were part of that advocacy day, either the 2019 or the 2020. And while that's up, I'll also say one thing. We were very fortunate that also before the shutdown, that the Cultural Advocacy Network of Michigan and the Michigan Downtown Association also had advocacy days at the Capitol and went and talked to the legislators, and those happened the week after ours. So for 2 weeks straight, the legislators were hearing about the historic preservation tax credit. So we really are appreciative to those two groups for being supportive and making that a main point of their advocacy days.
All right, so I just ended the poll and we'll share those results.
Okay, so most of you have not. We'd love to have you there in 2021, whatever the issue may be. We're hoping it will not be the historic preservation tax credit getting reauthorized. We'll reinstated. We'll keep our fingers crossed. All right, and then the final question, I kind of want to go back. We talked earlier about had you used the tax credit before, and now I'm curious how many of you have a building in mind that you'd like to use the tax credit for should it pass?
All right, I'll give everybody just a few more seconds. We're at about 77% voted. So if you need to hit submit, otherwise we'll end polling now and share those results.
Okay. So about half of you have a program in a building in mind, and others, if you want to know more, because you may have a building in mind, or you may want to share this with others that do in your community. So good to know, good to know. So with all that, that gets through the preliminary stuff, just get an idea of what the audience has done and how they participated with tax credits in the past. So now we'll get on and talk a little bit about the tax credit. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to talk about the tax credit, what's in the bill, how it works, and those type of things. And then I'm going to get into where the tax credit legislation is at this point, and then also what you can do to help get that legislation moving along. So we're first going to talk through the credit. Now, the first thing that just causes some complication for everybody is that if you have been to our website, www.mimpact.com, what you will learn from that is that there are two bills out there. There's Senate Bill 54 and there's House Bill 4100. The thing that's confusing is that neither of the bills that you see on the website are in any way the bills that are going to get passed if the tax credit passes. Now, you're going to say that makes no sense at all. Why do you have something out there that you don't know that'll pass? Those are the two bills that were introduced in January of 2019. There has been a lot of negotiation, a lot of work between committees, senators, representatives, bill drafters trying to figure out different ways to make the tax credit fit what they think will work for the state. Obviously, everybody has an opinion. There's a lot of negotiation, a lot of talking that's been going on about this credit. However, none of the bills that are out there now that have been negotiated have ever been introduced in any way. So therefore, the two bills you see on the site are actually the introduced bills. But we're not going to talk through those bills because, again, those bills, as you read them, will not be the bills that will be passed if the bill passes at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through the bills as they are now and tell you a little bit about them. And sometimes I'll go back and compare them to the original bills that you see. Sometimes I'm just not going to talk about that because it doesn't make a difference because they're pretty close to the same thing. So anyway, hopefully this will give you a good understanding of what we've got going and how the tax credit will work and where the bills are. Because right now, Senate Bill 54 and House Bill 4100 are different, and I'll point out those differences as we go through the webinar. So I just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page about a tax credit before we get started. I think most of you probably are. But a tax credit is a dollar-for-dollar reduction in the taxes owed. And the thing that's exciting about that is that it's a credit, not a deduction. A deduction is you figure out what your income is and you subtract the deduction and taxes, and then you figure out what your taxes are. A tax credit, you figure out what you owe in taxes, then you take the full amount of the credit. So and this is not even reality, but if you have a 10% credit and if you're in a 10% tax bracket and you have a $100,000 credit, that credit's worth $100,000. If it's deduction, if you're in a 10% tax bracket, it's worth $10,000. So deductions are great, credits are better, and this bill is a credit, and it's a credit against your tax income liability, your income tax liability. So that's really what the tax is about, and that's how it works. So what is the credit? The credit is a 25% credit on the expenditures you make on the rehab of a historic building. Now, in the old bills, the bills that are posted on the website, it has all these things about, well, if you get a federal credit, you have to subtract the 20% federal credit from what you get from the state. So basically, if there's a federal credit of 20%, you only get 5% from the state. However, in the current bills, both the Senate and the House, it's a full 25% credit. Does not matter what you get from the federal government, what you don't get from the federal government, everybody gets 25%. So that's a huge improvement in the tax credit because you don't have to think, well, I'm only going to end up getting 5%, so do I even want to mess with it, whatever. you get the 25% because everybody gets that. There's no working through any of that anymore. For residential properties to qualify for a tax credit, you have to spend at least $1,000. I think that's pretty easy, but it does have to be on rehab. It can't be on furniture or anything like that. It has to be on some type of rehab work. So it's very small for the residential, because when people want to do the homeowner projects, our legislators want to make sure you're able to get the credit and help you do that. For commercial property, it's a little bit different. You have to figure out what your state equalized value is for your property, and then your expenditures have to exceed 10% of that value. So if you have a value that's $250,000 for your property, then you have to spend at least $25,000 on that commercial property for you to be able to take a tax credit on that. They want to make sure that you're not just going in on putting up a new light fixture by the door and saying that's rehabilitation. They want to make sure that you're really doing something that's going to make a difference in that particular property and in the community that you're working with. So that's how you figure out those two different calculations. So I want to talk a little bit about, now you know what kind of property is eligible, I want to talk about who is eligible. For commercial credits, obviously an owner of the property can apply for the credit. But if you have a lease for a property, you want to do some improvements, and the owner's like, yeah, we're not going to pay for it, but we'll let you do it. We'll take some off your rent or whatever the case may be. You have to have at least a 31.5-year lease to get that. Some people are like, oh my gosh, that's outrageous. But a lot of times what happens is companies will own buildings and they will lease it to a management company to manage the property for them. And therefore the management company is doing the upkeep. And if the management company is doing the upkeep, then they'll take care of the building. And many, many times these are long-term leases to these management companies. And so that's kind of where that fits in. If it's a residential property, obviously an owner can apply, and you have to have a 27.5-year lease if you want to do work on a property that you're leasing. I don't know there'll be too many people that take advantage of that. That's probably a little extreme, and I really wish that was lower. We had discussions about that, but the legislature really was not interested in making that any smaller, or what I would consider more reasonable. So that's where we are with that one. So what types of entities can apply for a tax credit? Corporations, associations, partnerships, and individuals can apply for the credit as both of the bills are set now. But now the Senate has worked on their version to allow nonprofits to apply for the credit. We're going to talk about how a nonprofit can use the credit, because obviously you don't have any income tax, but just for now, know that you can apply and get a tax credit if you are a nonprofit. There's none of this jumping through the hoops and having to form a for-profit entity and put the building in a for-profit entity and stuff like that that's been talked about in the past in the Senate version. In the House version, if your nonprofit wants to take advantage of it, you do have to do that. You'd have to form a for-profit, put the building in the for-profit, hold it in the for-profit until 5 years after the project is done, then you could transfer it back. So the Senate's got taken all that out. They just felt like that was a lot of red tape. They didn't want in there. And I honestly assume that if the House bills continues to move, it'll take that into consideration too and change that proposal. But right now that's in the Senate bill and not the House bill. So how does a property itself qualify? We talked about how much you need to spend to qualify, but how do you qualify? You have to be listed in one of three ways. You have to be on the National Register of Historic Places, and that can be as an individual listing or as a contributing building in a landmark district. So if you're in a historic district that has a bunch of buildings in, as long as your building is listed as what they call contributing, meaning it's also historic, then your building would qualify without having to be individually listed. With the state, if you're on the State Register of Historic Sites, you can apply and you're eligible as well. With that, it's the same as the National Register. If you're in a district, if you're contributing, then you qualify. If you're individually listed, you qualify. Now, with local designation, if you have a historic district commission, those buildings qualify as well. As you probably know, in Michigan, there's not a way to have an individual listing unless that individual listing is considered a district in and of itself. A single building can be a district, but in this case, if you're contributing building to the district, whether you're a single building in that district or whether there's multiple building in that district, you qualify. So there's one of three ways you can do that. Any of those work. You don't have to be one or the other for any special reason. You don't have to be two of the above or anything like that. As long as you're listed one of those three ways, then you would be eligible for that tax credit. I want to talk a little bit about the process because if you haven't been through the tax credit process, you may not understand exactly how it works. And this will play into how the bill is set up in a moment. And that's one of the reasons I really want to talk through that. This is set up exactly like the federal tax credit program is set up to make it easy for everybody. So if you're doing both, you can do them concurrently. So the first part is what's called a Part 1 tax credit application. That's where you are verifying that, yes, my property is historically designated. It's on the National Register, it is on the state register, or it is in a local historic district and qualifies. So that's what you're doing with Part 1, only saying that, yes, I do qualify that. And the reason the state does it and does it this way is they don't want somebody going through a lot of trouble figuring out a lot of stuff, put in a big application if they don't even qualify. So they want to tell them if they qualify first. And this is the way to determine if you qualify. Part 2 is once you determine that you qualified, you need to put in a plan of what you plan to do. So it's the application that comes in that says, here's my project, here's what I plan to do, well, here are the current conditions, and here's what I plan to do. This has to be very detailed. I mean, if you're going in and your plan is, I'm gonna put a new roof on my house, then you can probably have an estimate from a contractor and some specs on what the roof type's gonna be and a picture of your roof as it currently is, and they're gonna be able to give you a yes or no. If you're doing a complete rehabilitation, then you're looking at going out and having an architect or engineer do the design so you can really show what you're doing, and so that the person that's reviewing this at the State Historic Preservation Office can really understand what you're doing and how it fits in with your project and how it fits the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. So it's a little more complicated the more complicated your project is. But you know, if you submit something or you're not sure what to submit, then you can always contact the State Historic Preservation Office, and they can definitely give you guidance on what kind of information they would need to move this forward. So in this plan, in this part, you also put in not only the rehabilitation plan, you need to put in your cost estimates as well. So this is what it's going to cost me. And you can't go, and you don't want to go in there and put, well, I think it's going to cost me this because, you know, roofs generally cost this. You want to have an estimate from somebody that says, yes, I can actually do this work for this amount of money. And that way, everybody knows that the project can get done for the amount of money that you're talking about. And the state's going to briefly look at that and see if they think it's reasonable. Unless it's really out of whack, they're not going to go in there and start comparing numbers and get real particular about it. But they will check, and, you know, to make sure with it, it's somewhat within the range of reason when you're putting in those that budget. So then you're going to go to Part 3. And Part 3 is what you do when you've completed your project. And what you do is you take a bunch of pictures of what you've done. You get all your bills that you did for the project put together, and you submit that to the State Historic Preservation Office. And what you're saying there is, this is what I told you I was going to do in Part 2, and now I'm showing you that I actually did that. Now, as far as the costs go, we know there's going to be parts that, you know, cost more, parts that cost less, because things turned to be a lot bigger problem than they thought they were going to be, or they thought they would need extra money to do something. It turned out to be an easier piece of the project than they thought. So, you know, your cost estimates won't exactly match what you actually spend when you turn in your Part 3, but they should be somewhere closer. If not, then, you know, you've submitted an amendment to your Part 2 and said, hey, I got this problem, and this is going to change things, so that they know what's going on with that. So anyway, the Part 3 is what you submit, and when you submit that, that is when your certificate for the tax credits is actually awarded to you for the project that you've done, once you've proven that you've done what you said you were going to do. Now, sometimes people run into problems because they get into a project and they decide to make changes, and they don't discuss this with the State Historic Preservation Office. If you're going to have a change in your project so that you don't run into a problem when you submit your Part 3, you always want to submit something to the State Historic Preservation Office to say, this is the change we need to make, this is why, this is how it meets the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. So, one of the things that has happened with the bills is, if you look at the bill that was originally in place, it's on miimpact.com, there is no cap on the tax credit, meaning that if everybody and their mother in Michigan does a tax credit project in 2021, they can all take the tax credit, and the state of Michigan will have no money left in their budget because everybody took a tax credit for the project that they did. As you might imagine, that made the legislature a little nervous because, you know, none of us have any idea. We can make predictions on how many people will use the tax credit. We can make predictions on, we can show numbers for how many people used it in the past per year. So we can get a good idea of what to expect from that, but we can't with all, confidence say this is exactly what you're going to see this year and this is how it's going to work. So they felt like in both houses of the legislature, they need to put a cap on it. So in the Senate version, and the Senate version is the one that's gotten the most attention and the most play so far, that cap has bounced around a lot to get to a point where the people that need to vote yes will vote yes. And so what you see on there is that it is a very small credit for each calendar year. There is a $7 million credit, and that's all the tax credits that the state will give out to anybody for historic preservation in that one given year. And small number, but it's still a number that's useful. But there was concern when the number got that small that there were going to be a couple big projects that would swallow up all the money, or maybe even one big project, and nobody else would have a chance at the tax credits. So what they went in and did is they went in and they segregated the money into different segments so they made sure it was spread out. There is $4 million for commercial projects, for projects that have expenses, not credits, but expenses of $2 million or more. So for the big projects, there's $4 million. For smaller projects, and I have a typo in this slide because it should say 2 million, it says 3 million, and I apologize, I can't do math, but there's 2 million for projects that are less than 2 million. So not your tax credits, but if your expenditures are less than 2 million, there's $2 million out there for you. Now, that means that there's a better chance of you getting a credit if you're in a smaller project, if you're working on a smaller project than there is if you getting a credit if you're having a larger project, because obviously the larger projects take more credits because they're spending more money and they use up their money much quicker than the smaller projects. And then the last piece of the pie that the legislature wanted to make sure people had was $1 million for residential projects, make sure the homeowners didn't get left out. Now, if any of these projects do not have requests for that much money in one calendar year, the money at the very end of the year can be moved to another category. But that can't happen until, say, December, because you have to know that you're not getting any other applications in those particular categories, so it can switch around a little bit. There was also concern that if you had, in the large pool, you had $4 million, well, that's one person's project. I mean, if you're doing a large tax credit project, they're likely to take up that whole $4 million. So they wanted to spread that out a little bit too. So they put a cap that no project could get more than $2 million in a credit for any one single year. Now, that doesn't mean that a person can do a project and say, well, I want $2 million in 2021, I want $2 million in 2022, and $2 million in 2023, and whatever I happen to get done, I want a credit for that. But what it does mean is if you can find ways to phase your project and submit your project in phases, knowing what you're going to do in different years, you can spread out that credit and get a little bit more for your particular project. And that's how that would work. Now, the House bill is a little different, and I actually don't expect this number to stay where it is because of our current budget situation. Before we had the pandemic and the disaster that's done to the budget for the state, I think this had somewhat of a chance to go through the House this way. Now, I really don't think it has a chance at all. But they have a $65 million cap. And the only segregation they made in theirs was $3 million for residential, and the rest could go to any commercial project. But they figured that, as long as you see below that, they capped each project at $5 million instead of $2 million. And they figured with that cap, then, a number of projects, large and small, would be able to take advantage of the credit. So they weren't worried about segregating the small projects and the large projects because they had a lot of money to throw around. Again, I don't think that will be what we will see coming out of the House as this move forward, just because they don't have the budget they can comfortably say we're going to give $65 million to. I just see that given almost every legislator heartburn. So in both bills, you may claim your credit for up to 10 years after the project completion date. That's not the date you start the project, but the date that you receive your certificate for saying you did your tax credit project and you got your tax credits. You have 10 years to claim your credit. The state does not tell you in which of those 10 years you have to claim the credit, except that you must claim it one time within the first 5 years, or they will no longer consider the credit valid. So you need to make sure that if you've got thinking, 8 years from now, I'm gonna have a big windfall, I want to save it for that, you need to find a way to take at least 1 year, a portion of that credit, so that it would still be good 8 years from now. So that's something to think about. The purpose of the 10 years is really to help people who have income tax liability, but not a large amount of tax liability, to be able to spread it out and take advantage of the credit and give them some return for the big project that they did. Once you get through with the project, for 5 years, there's 2 things that you have to do. And the first one is that you have to maintain your property under the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. So the same guidelines that you follow to do your project, you have to follow those guidelines to maintain your building after the project is complete for the next 5 years. The state wants to protect their investment. One thing that I didn't say about the Secretary of Interior standards and how you go about a project is, for a historic tax credit project, the only way you qualify for a tax credit and get your Part 3 is if everything you do meets the Secretary of Interior standards. You can't dice up a project and say, well, I want a credit for this part because it meets the Secretary of Interior standards, but I won't ask for a credit for this part because I know it doesn't meet those standards. The entire project has to meet the standards whether you want a credit for it or not in order to claim the credit. So it's very important to understand that these credits are all or nothing. So either you follow the standards or you don't. There's no middle ground on that. I mean, there may be some things that you have to negotiate and work through because they're kind of on the line to whether they meet the standard or not. But if they're determined not to meet the standard, you would either have to change the way you're doing it, or you wouldn't be able to get any credits at all. So just keep that in mind as you're working on the project. But then after you finish the project, you can't immediately go back and say, well, this is the thing I wanted to do. It doesn't meet the standard. Someone do it the day after I get the credits. If that's what you're going to do, which we hope you don't do, you have to wait at least 5 years to make that change. The other thing about the credits is the states will also want to maintain their investment, or making sure it's a property owner that's going to use that property and maintain ownership of that property and maintain the standards that they have. So you're required in the law to hold on to the property for 5 years after the project's completed. So if it takes you 2 years to complete the project, and you bought the building right as you were starting the project, you will need to own that building for 7 years to not have to pay back any of your tax credits. Now, with the 5-year rule for ownership or the Secretary of Interior standards, what happens is, in the first year, if you don't follow these rules, you have to pay your entire tax credit back. In the second year, it's 80%. The third year, it's 60%. The fourth year, it's 40%. The fifth year, it is 20%. And then obviously after the 5th year, you don't have to worry about that anymore. But so the liability does go down year per year after you move away from your completion date, but it is there to some degree until you get to the end of those 5 years. So one of the things that people first say is that I don't have enough income tax liability, or I'm a nonprofit. The tax credits are really not going to do me any good. Well, the great thing about the state tax credit, which is not true about the federal, is that these credits are transferable. That means that you can take your credit and you can transfer it to somebody with income tax liability. That's why the Senate bill allows the nonprofits to take the credit. They can't use it against their taxes, but they can transfer it to somebody that can. And you think, well, that's great. I can give it to my friend. I can give it to the business down the street. But how does that help me? Well, typically, when you transfer the credits, you don't have to. But typically, when you transfer the credits, you sell the credits. And those credits, it varies in what they sell for by the market. But generally, those tax credits can sell for 90 cents on the dollar. So if you have a tax credit that's worth $100,000, you can sell it to somebody for $90,000. And you think, well, why would somebody pay me $90,000 for a tax credit? Well, they owed $100,000 on their taxes. They have a credit that's worth $100,000, but they only paid you $90,000 for it. So they saved $10,000 in money going out because they covered their $100,000 with your tax credits and only paid you $90,000 for those tax credits. So the transfer can be a really good deal. And I get asked all the time, can you really find people to buy the credits? Yes, you can. Sometimes individuals buy those credits, but there's a number of companies that, they have all kind of tax liability. They're looking for any way to reduce their tax liability to any extent that they can. So the tax credit market is a pretty lucrative market. So if you have tax credits, you can get those sold. And there's also brokers out there that will help you find somebody if you don't know who to sell your tax credits to. Now, of course, they're going to charge you a percentage of the tax credits that you're selling, to be able to broker it for you. But if you don't know and you can't find somebody to do that, it's sometimes worth the expense to do that. So there are people out there that can help with that. Now, the other thing that I mentioned that I think is important is that I told you that the owner had to retain ownership of that building for 5 years after the completion of the state tax credit project. Well, there is a way around that. And the law has in that the way around that is if you can find somebody that'll buy it, and if you can get them to sign a legal document that says they will maintain that building in accordance with the Secretary of Interior standards through the end of that 5-year compliance period, and you file that and record that with the deed and can prove that, then you can sell your building. So when I told you before, you can't sell it, that's true unless you go through these steps and make sure that you have formally transferred the responsibility of maintaining that building to the Secretary of Interior standards to the new owner, because the state does not have the ability to do that because they've already given out the credit. So the only person they have to come back on is you, unless you write an agreement with somebody that says, if this happens, yes, I will pay for any credit that has to be returned. And so the state's wanting to make sure that they have a way to claw back their money should the property be transferred. And I think that's logical, instead of people doing projects transfer and the state have no recourse, because they are putting money into these projects so they will be rehabbed in accordance with the Secretary of Interior standards. One of the other things that the Senate bill has introduced that is not in the House bill is when the tax credit was around in the past, there was no reporting that was required for any economic impact that the credit has had. And obviously the state's given a tax credit, they want there to be some kind of impact. Some people are happy about the social impact because it's revitalizing communities, it's bringing back neighborhoods that were in bad shape, really taking doing great things for an area and making, lively people places, saving places that are really important to the history of Michigan and tell our story. But there's others that want to say, if I'm giving out money from the state budget, I want to make sure that we're getting some kind of return that's monetary on that outlay of money. And unfortunately, we do not know that from the tax credit that was enacted between 1999 and 2011 because those records aren't kept. Now, we can do studies, we can do extrapolations, we can do all kinds of things to figure that out. But many legislators are like, we want to know project by project. So when I'm looking at a project in my neighborhood or my district, I want to know how this impacted our economy, what it did for us, why it was worth making the investment economically. So what they've done is they've made a list of things that they're going to require individual people to report when they finish their project. These are for commercial projects, not residential, but for commercial projects that are giving them an idea of how much economic development occurred and how much economic stimulus occurred because of that particular project. Now, I think when I say this to people, the first thing they are is horrified. Like, how do I figure this out? Well, the State Historic Preservation Office is going to help talk you through that if you don't know. And with the State Historic Preservation Office being in the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, they do this for so many of the grants and tax credit programs that they have. This is nothing new, and they can really help walk you through this. So I tell people, you may not know how to do it. It is going to be a little bit of a heartburn to go through and get it done, but it won't be that bad. And you do have people that will help you if this bill is there and if it's passed, because everybody wants this to be successful. Obviously, the State Historic Preservation Office and the Michigan Economic Development Corporation want you to get your tax credit if you've done a good project and followed the rules and the standards, and they had given you a credit to move forward on. So what are they asking for? They're asking you for your total rehab cost. And you say, well, I'm reporting that with my tax credits, and you probably are. But just in case there's something that you really weren't asking tax credits for that still follow the Secretary of Interior standards, they want to make sure you're filing, this is the total amount I spent on rehab. They also want to give your total capital improvement cost, because there may be some things that you'll do that meet the Secretary of Interior standards that won't qualify for tax credits. Say, if you need to add on some kind of staircase for ADA accessibility, you need a little bit of extra room, so you add a building in the back, and you've done everything in accordance with the Secretary of Interior standards. You can't get tax credit on any of those things, but they're allowable. The state wants to know how much you spend in total, so they want those things added in. If you're having to run, a water or sewer line or that type of thing, That won't be in your credit, but yet it will be a capital outlay for that project. They want to know the total capital improvements. They want to know the labor hours that went into construction. So they want to know how many people got work because of the labor that you did to rehab that building. They also want to know, as far as labor, is if you're doing a building that's going to be used for, say, retail or a restaurant, or even, apartments where you have to lease out the apartments, how many jobs will be working on that property that were not there before the rehab? So how many jobs are you bringing to the community through your rehab? They also want to know what that payroll was. So they want a dollar figure on that amount, on that jobs that you create, how much money we've done. And again, people aren't going to know exactly, but you've done a business plan more than likely if you're doing a rehab. So you can have some ideas of stuff that you can give to that. They also want to know what the gain of property value will be. Because obviously, if you've taken a building that needed rehab and you rehabbed it, especially if it was derelict, there's going to be a change in the property value. So how much did the property value change? They want you to be able to record that. They want to know how much income tax will be paid because of the rehab. And so, there were people that were working, they were generating labor hours, they were getting paid a salary. How much income taxes did those people pay when they were working on that building, be it the architects, the contractors, engineers, anybody associated with that work? And then once you move into the building and it's occupied, you have your business operating out of it, what do you expect your income tax payments to be after that? And they're looking for state income tax. They're looking for local income tax that you'll be paying. Who all are you paying taxes to that will be stimulating the economy here in Michigan? And then finally, they're looking for sales tax information. How much sales tax did you pay on materials that you bought when you were working on the building and when it was under construction? And then how much sales tax do you see you paying when you are operating the building? So if you're doing retail, restaurant, whatever you're doing that generates sales taxes, how much you pay to that? They want to know the state and the local taxes that you'll be paying. And this really gives them a great economic impact picture of what your project has done. So yes, it's a lot of information. Yes, it's going to be a little bit difficult to get them, but it's going to be invaluable information for the state to have, to know they've invested in a tax credit that is really worth the investment that the state's making. And what they'll learn, we're sure, is that you doing a project and then giving out money is bringing more money to the state than it's giving out. And that's what they want to see, because we tell them that all the time, but they want the proof. And you can't blame them. They've got a tight budget to manage even in good years. So you want them to be able to see that, yes, this is a valuable credit. It is doing good things. So the one thing that I want to finish with is in the Senate bill, there is a 10-year sunset on the bill, meaning that the bill will go away and no longer exist after 10 years. Now, a sunset is kind of bad because that means you have to go reauthorize the credit at some point in time. But the other good thing about a credit is because you have to reauthorize it, it gives everybody the opportunity to go out and tell legislators, because they'll be new then because of term limits, about what the tax credits are, how they work, and why that's important. So that way, instead of somebody looking around saying, what do we do about the tax credit? Because, we don't know if this is good law or not. We can just go ahead and put a bill in there to get rid of it. You're having to go out there and tell them what good it's doing, and you're having to present a case to them every 10 years. It keeps it in the front of their minds, so it's not a bad thing in that way. We're also very excited that sunset was decided to be 10 years, because our fear was when the idea of a sunset first appeared was that it could be 3 years, and you're thinking, well, gosh, you're not going to have any data in 3 years to go in there and argue to reauthorize it. But in 10 years, we should have very good data, especially with the economic information that they're asking. And so anyway, we're very excited to see that it's a 10-year sunset. And honestly, from our perspective at MHPN, I really don't think that's a terrible thing. It does cost some effort every 10 years to get it reauthorized, but at the same time, as I said before, I think it's something that is very, very good for us to be talking about in that time period. A couple things that I do want to go back and mention that I did not mention as we went through the process is that when we're talking about the part ones, part twos, and part threes, the part two, when you apply, is when the state reserves your tax credit, not when you finish the project. That way, when you put in your part two and you say, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how much it's going to cost, then if they approve your tax credit, you can go to anybody you're working with for financing reasons or what have you, and tell them, yes, I have a certificate from the state that says they will give me so much in tax credits if I complete this project in the way that I said I was going to do it and spend this much money. So you have a certificate there. That means, though, that as you start your project, those estimates may or may not be correct because you don't know. You're making estimates. You don't know what you're going to run into. So the tax credit has a provision in it when you turn in your part three that if you spent more money than you expected to spend and that money is eligible for tax credits, then you can put in a separate application to get that difference paid to you. Now, the problem you have is if they've already given out the $7 million for that year and there's no money left, you don't get any of that extra money that you spent and wouldn't plan on spending. But if there's money there, then they can approve that extra money and that extra tax credit, just like you were applying for a new credit. So my advice to people is that, when you're putting together a budget for a tax credit, make sure you have a good contingency in there when you're asking for that tax credit. That way the money's in there ahead of time and you're not worried about, oh, when I finish my project, will there be any of the $7 million or $65 million or whatever it is left to cover that difference. So that will make a difference. So think of that as you're doing that type of thing. So before I move on to the tax credit and where it is, I want to see if anybody has questions on the tax credit, how it's set up, and why it's going to operate the way it was, or is there something I didn't explain well? So I see a couple questions in the chat that had to do with how this affects some other stuff, but I want to talk about first the things that we went through. I went through just now about how it works, see if anybody has any specific questions for that. So Mallory, I'm not sure if I understand how to get to the question and answers. So if you have any, can you read those out?
Yeah, so we have a question. Do other states allow nonprofits to apply without a for-profit needing to be created for the purpose of the rehab and using the credit?
Yes, there's 8 states that do. If you ask me to name them off the top of my head, I'm not going to be able to do it. But I know that because the legislators that were working on this addition of nonprofits to this bill asked us that question. And we were very fortunate in that the National Trust for Historic Preservation did a study in 2018. And part of that study, they found which ones work with nonprofits. And there's 8 states that allow nonprofits to directly benefit from the tax credit. It varies from state to state how it works. There's some states where if you're a nonprofit, you get a tax credit, you can ask for a refund, not a refund, but you can ask for payment from the state because you can't take a tax credit. But most states are the same way that it is here, that you would have to transfer them to do that. And that's what the legislators here decided to go with.
And a follow-up to that question is, do the nonprofit types, could they be applied to churches?
The thing about churches is difficult. It has to be an income producing property. And passing the offering plate or taking online donations or taking donations of any kind is not income producing. Income producing means that you're selling something and you're taking in money for it. So if you can show that you have a church that regularly rents out its building for weddings and you charge people, I don't know, $3,000 to do their wedding at your church. I haven't done that, so I don't know if that's a reasonable amount or not. I'm just throwing out a number. But if you can show that you do that on a regular basis, then that becomes income producing property. So, and that's also true, something to think about if you're a museum, because there's some museums that offer where, we're not going to charge an admission, but you can make a donation of whatever you want to at the door. Come in. If you're asking for a donation, it's not income producing. Those museums could not use a tax credit. But if they're charging people $5 to come in and everybody's paying that $5, unless they have a special pass or something, then they're income producing. So you have to think about how you do these things and have to make sure that you're making sure you're operating your property in a way that is income producing to qualify.
Thank you. Does the 5-year ownership apply to residential properties also?
It does. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So, but that, that's one of the things that's good about the fact that you can sell your property. with a covenant on it that says that that person will follow the Secretary of Interior standards and maintain the property to them with whatever's left of that 5 years. Because if you're a person that wants to go in and flip properties and you're doing it, for good reasons, you're helping revitalize the neighborhood by flipping the properties. I mean, you're moving people in that are going to take care of the property, that value it because it's in great shape. They wouldn't have bought it beforehand because they don't do rehab, but they're excited that, hey, I got this great historic rehab property. Then you can do it. You just have to make sure the person signing that agreement, they will maintain it to those standards for the remainder of those 5 years. So there's a way to do it, but yes, it does apply.
What might happen if you have an offer to purchase the commercial property prior to the 5 years? So this kind of goes into what you were just talking about again. The purchaser has to sign an agreement that they will maintain the standards, correct?
Yeah, you just have to have that in place. There's nothing going to keep you from doing that. One of the things this bill doesn't have in it, that the Colorado bill has that I really like, but we just haven't gotten any interest in this piece here in Michigan, is that if you have an option to purchase a building, because you're not going to purchase that building unless you know you can put together the financial stack to do the rehabilitation, and the tax credit's an important piece of that, then you can use that option to qualify for the credit. And you just have to own the property before the rehabilitation is complete. But that keeps people from feeling like they have to purchase a property to be able to apply for the credits. We didn't get any traction on that here, but I think it's something that, maybe in the future we can look to tweak, because I think it is important, because sometimes, you're like, I really want to buy that building. I really want to do that rehab, but I certainly can't bite this off unless I know I can put it together. And applying for and getting that approval for your tax credit is important to do that. But again, if you're going to sell it at any point, you just have to have that agreement in place and make sure that happens.
All right. What is the evaluation criteria for approving residential projects? Is it a first come, first serve for complete qualified applications until the $1 million cap is met per calendar year? And a follow-up question, do you anticipate this process will be competitive?
Well, I think it'll be competitive in that there will be people submitting to get the tax credits. It's in no way competitive in the way that is your project better than the person's before, because as you stated at the first, it's a first come, first serve system. So if you put in your project and your application is complete at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, and I put mine in at 9:30, and yours took all the rest of the tax credits, you're going to get the tax credit. I'm not going to get the tax credit. So what the State Historic Preservation Office and Michigan Economic Development Corporation plan to do is set up a system where these things are time stamped, so you know who's came in when, and that way they can keep up with the project. And that actually brings up something else that I probably should have mentioned earlier that I do want to mention, is that if you apply for a tax credit, you have to start your project within 1 year of that tax credit getting its Part 2 approval. That's to keep people from going in and tying up those tax credits for projects they may never do, or projects that may not start for 3 or 4 years. They want projects that are close to being shovel ready to get the credits, because they want to see this credit making a difference as soon as possible. They don't want to see it sitting out there for years and years and years and lingering. So, you're not doing yourself any good to go in there and apply for a credit for a project you're not going to start within the next 12 months. You want to make sure if you get that credit, you can get started, because if not, that credit will be taken back from you and be given to somebody else. Because the way this process will work is that if they have more people apply for credits than the credits are available, those people go on a waiting list in the order that they applied. So if projects come back that don't get started within that year, that money can go to those people that had already applied and were sitting there. Also, if you get to year 2 after year 1 and there's some people on the waiting list, they're going to be the first people in line for year 2. So, if you apply for a credit, it's not like you're totally out of luck if you don't make it under that cap, but it does mean you're going to have to at least wait a little while before that credit's available to you. Now, you can go ahead and start your project. The problem is if you do anything that's not approved and it turns out not to meet the Secretary of Interior standards, you would have to redo it to get your tax credits or forgo the tax credits you hope to get. So it's always a little risky in starting a project before you've got SHPO approval, but you can do that. But you do have to make sure that if you're having to sit on your project, if you sit on your tax credits, there's none available to the next year, that you don't finish your project, because it's harder to go back and get your tax credit after your project is finished. You want to make sure that you get it before you start, ideally, or if not that, shortly thereafter.
Okay, we still have more questions coming in. These are all really good. So, what is the reporting period for the economic impact data? That is it required with Part 3? And are nonprofits also exempt from this in the Senate bill, like residential properties?
First of all, no, nonprofits are not exempt because, you might not be paying any taxes, but if you're paying your staff, you're paying income taxes and that type of thing. So they want to know what you're paying. I mean, you may not be paying sales taxes or maybe some other things you're not doing, but you're employing people, you're paying income taxes, you're paying those type of things. So no, you would have to report that data so that the state's aware of that as well. The timeline is that when you turn in your Part 3, you have to have all this information together. So if you want that tax credit certificate, you have to pay for it. So if you're like, well, I'm not worried about getting my tax credit certificate anytime soon, you can sit on that for a while. But you do need to get all that information in. So trying to figure out what that's going to be and how that's going to work as you go along is always important because you want to be able to have that readily available to submit with your tax credit. Because keep in mind that, not only if you wait on getting your tax credit, it throws it into another year that puts it behind when you can claim your tax credit, but it also extends your compliance period because everything starts from the time that you get that certificate for your compliance period and for when you can first take the tax credit itself. So trying to figure out ways to get this economic data available as soon as possible when you're finishing your project is good to do. So if I were making suggestions, I would say if you're not exactly sure how to put this together, I would make those calls to the State Historic Preservation Office as my project was coming to an end, so I'd be prepared to be able to put all that together.
And then a point to clarify. So what is the reporting period for the economic impact data, which I think the question is asking, like, what is the period of time you need to be tracking that for? Is that over the course of the project?
Sure. That is not specific in the bill. For the stuff that's project specific, it is for the life of the project. So while you're doing construction, you're going to report every bit of that. When they say how much income are you going to generate afterwards, how much sales tax, how many employees are you going to have, those type of things, that's not specified in the bill. That is something that the Economic Development Corporation and the State Historic Preservation Office will have to determine as they put that information together. One of the things that's in the bill, and it's in almost every bill that goes through that has to be managed by the state, is there is what's called a rulemaking process that the department that operates the program has to go through. So they make rules for the program, they ask for public input. I'm assuming that how many years and how that form turns out will be part of the rulemaking process that the State Historic Preservation Office will go through. Those are things that they try not to put so specifically in bills, because if they try something and it becomes, this doesn't work like they thought it would, it gives because it's rulemaking, it's much, much easier to change and fix it to where people are actually given the information that the legislators want than having to go back and redo a whole bill because somebody didn't think something through, or, you just have unintended consequences, because that happens all the time with new things.
Okay, I do want to note the time. It is almost 2 o'clock. We are going to continue to answer questions. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask, do type them into the Q&A. If you have to hop off this webinar to participate in something else, this will all, like I said, be recorded, and the recording will be sent out to you hopefully early next week. So
Mallory?
Yes.
If we can take just a break from the questions, I do want to talk about where the bill sits now before people get off, because we have not talked about that at all.
Sure.
And so I'd like to give people an opportunity if they need to go to hear that really quickly, because that's one of the things that I would want to know if I was listening to the webinar. So I'm going to jump to that, and then we'll come back to questions if that's okay.
That is fine with me. So we will answer all your questions. So hold tight.
Sure. So where is the bill? The bill had its first reading in the Senate Finance Committee in December of last year. And if you know how the legislative process works, to get out of a committee, it takes 2 readings. The second reading was scheduled for the week of March 23rd. And we all know what happened the week of March 23rd. So therefore, that bill has not had a second reading in the Senate Finance Committee. Currently, the Senate Finance Committee is not able to hear any bills that are unrelated to the COVID-19 response. And this bill has not been determined to be part of the COVID-19 response because they're basically dealing with health issues and opening issues and that kind of thing, not stimulus issues. So therefore, this is not a bill that can get in there. So we know that the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and we also know that the Senate Majority Leader would like for this bill to be heard as soon as they open the Senate Finance Committee up to new bills again. And we just don't know when that's going to be. I even asked yesterday, so I'd be prepared for this conversation today in case they knew something I didn't know. Unfortunately, we do not know that. But that's where it'll need to go. So it'll go through the Senate Finance Committee, and then it'll go on the Senate floor. Now, how will it do in the Senate floor? We don't know. The Senate Finance Committee, we have a lot of positive response from the members of that committee. We feel like it will pass the Senate Finance Committee. The Senate floor is a little bit tougher because we had been doing really well on the Senate floor, but now you have the issue with the budget disaster that the state has. And there's some people that see this budget, this bill as a great economic stimulus. There's other people that see this bill as a drain on a budget that's already tighter than they could possibly imagine it could be. So we're not exactly sure how this is going to play out when it reaches the Senate floor. We're working hard to talk about it being an economic stimulus, how it's going to be helpful to have this bill, how it's $7 million. It's not going to affect the budget to that great of a degree at this point. And I think we've got some good support on that. Like I say, we've got support of the Senate Majority Leader, Mike Shirkey. We're feeling good about that. So that's going to be very helpful. But we just don't know. And quite honestly, I mean, it's like everything else. Nobody really knows because we don't know how much damage the pandemic has done to the budget already and how much it will continue to do before things return to normal. So we really just don't know in that case. When we get to the House, the bill has been sent to the Tax Policy Committee in the House. It has not had a hearing. They have not shown much interest in giving it a hearing at this point. We do expect that to change if it gets through the Senate and the Senate approves the bill, because then this bill will be sent over to the House saying, hey, you got anything that matches it? Will you approve it? And that will give us a good chance to take it up. We have some very enthusiastic supporters in the House, so we hope that'll move along, but that was just a little bit more sketchy at this point about how this moves along. In the governor's office, we had excellent support prior to the pandemic. Obviously, having a discussion about the state historic preservation tax credit is not something that's easy to have with the governor's office right now, considering the volume of work they're having to do. So we really don't know if this has changed the governor's mind on this bill and where it'll end up in the governor's office. So we are cautiously optimistic this can still pass. And as I saw one question asked, you know, one of the things that you want to do is talk about this being an economic stimulus that is going to get people back to work. It is going to help, you know, buildings that aren't able to be used for economic purposes. It's going to allow them to be used and reopened to be a benefit economically to that community and bring life to areas that need life because of the pandemic. And it will put, you know, architects, engineers, contractors, construction workers, all back to work, which is very, very important for us to see going on as we come out of this pandemic period. So I think we've got a lot of good arguments to make. We just have to be willing to make those. A couple other things just to show you real quickly. The tax credit was around from 1999 to 2011. We know that the state invested $1.98 billion in the tax credits. We know that tax credits that were taken here in Michigan also got $316 million from federal tax credits. We also know that there was 32,000 jobs, and that's an estimate, so it's not an exact number. We estimated that based on some studies that have been done elsewhere. And then there was a $9.58 million economic impact, and that's an actual direct expenditures. That's not extrapolated where you go in and say the direct impact, because if I paid my employee, he went out, bought his groceries at the local market or whatever. That's $9.58 were actually expended for every dollar that was put into the program. So it's not a bad thing for the state of Michigan to see as far as a return. They're not getting all that money back, but if you're spending that kind of money, $9.58 for every dollar spent, you know, you're doing pretty well as far as your return. So we're very excited to show those numbers. Also, one of the things we like to tell people is, one of the things that make legislators leery about tax credits. So we give people all these tax credits, they're going to create all these jobs, they're going to do all these things, and then we never see the result. And we've given out all the money and it's too late now because we just trusted them. With this tax credit, you come in and you say, this is what I'm going to do. This is how my project's going to work. And you reserve a tax credit, but you don't actually get a tax credit until you've proven you've done exactly what you said you were going to do. So they're not going to analyze your economic data to see if it really made an economic impact, but they're going to look at your project and say, they said they were going to rehab the building. They said this is how they were going to do it. They said this is how much money they're going to spend. Did they actually do all that before the state gives you one dime? And I think that's great to tell legislators because they know they got what they asked for their money before that money goes out the door. And that's not the case with a lot of other tax credits. And that's what makes a lot of legislators nervous because they're just hoping for the best. This, they don't have to hope for the best. And then the argument when you look at residential, because we do have some people that says, well, people should be able to keep up their own homes. I mean, we shouldn't be helping them keep up the home if they can't keep it up. Find somebody that can buy it that can keep it up. I mean, we've heard those comments. But I think that, it's more than just keeping up these homes, it's maintaining neighborhoods, it's stabilizing, increasing property values because, when you go in and you do rehab and your house is not the only one that benefits, it benefits your neighbors because your neighborhood's in better shape because of your rehab. So talking about how it maintains and revitalizes neighborhoods is extremely important when you're making those arguments to the people at the state legislature. And finally, just want to invite you back to visit our MI Impact site because there's FAQs. Some of the questions you're asking me, you can find answers to them on the website. It talks a little bit about how you can support. And I was going to do some questions, but since we're running long, I won't do that. But how you can support. Call your legislator, email your legislator, send a letter to your legislator. That's unique. People don't do that as much anymore. They might appreciate the actual letter. You can also, we've been spending some time trying to get different municipalities and counties and townships to endorse this historic preservation tax credit, saying they want this in their community, it's important to their community. You can see on MI Impact who has done resolutions to that effect. You can see who has not done and who's missing. If your community has not done a resolution, it may be a little difficult now because there's so many issues they have to discuss. But if you can get them to pass a resolution, that's extremely helpful. We would love for you to do that. You can also find one-pagers that give details about the tax credit, some of the things we've talked about today. You can find sample letters to do your letters and to write them. There's sample resolutions if you can get somebody to do a resolution. There's case studies on projects that were done with the tax credit in the past. So people can say, yeah, look what it did for this building in our community, or look what it did for that community over there. Don't we want something like that to happen with such and such building? You can get a really good idea of that. And unfortunately, the bills we have to post right now are not the current bills, but the bills that were introduced in 2019 are up there. And it still tells you a lot about the tax credit. It just has the extra, you have to take the 20% out. It does not have a cap and the things that work with that. It makes it a little bit different, but you still get a good gist of it. So I think that's all that I basically wanted to talk about, and we can get back to the questions, both on the project, how it works itself, or advocacy work pertaining to the tax credit.
All right, perfect. So I feel like you kind of covered this question, but just to reiterate, someone was asking, are the bills in the Senate or the House either or will they be combined in some way? How does that process work?
So what will happen is both chambers of the legislature will pass their own bills. Ideally, they would look the same and then everything's great. We don't think these two will look the same because there's different issues about the tax credit in each chamber of the legislature. So we think what will happen is that you will have two different bills and they will come together and there will be a conference committee put together by both senators and our representatives to discuss how do we get a bill that combines these bills and gives us one bill we can all support. So we think you'll end up with some kind of combo bill that's a mishmash of how they figure out how to put that together at the end. And that's why, if you don't like the $7 million cap in the Senate, you push for a larger cap in the House because if they have to negotiate it, it's not going to be 65 million, but, maybe it'll be 15 million. Who knows what it'll be? So, like I say, it would be ideal if they were the same, and they did start out that way. But now, I have to tell you that the sponsor in the House and the sponsor in the Senate have had discussions, and they're purposely different. And so that's a good thing. They're working through this to try to get the best credit we can get, and they're both quite happy that they're different right now.
Okay. So now I'm just going to start at the top and go one by one through all of the questions so we can answer them all. So we had a question, say you end up with $10 million in credits to allocate per year. So that's the cap, I think. How will the credits be allocated? First come, first serve, with part twos submitted beginning on January 1st through competitive application. So again, we kind of touched on this already, but just to clarify.
Right. The way that bill is set up is it would take effect on January 1st of 2021. And basically on January 2nd, applications would start coming in on a first come, first served basis until that 10 million is used up. Now, the one question I can't answer right now is how the sub allocations work. So now we have 4, 2, and 1 that add up to the $7 million. If it becomes $10 million, I don't know how that breakdown will be. It'll be adjusted, obviously, because it'll have to be. But how that gets adjusted, I can't say. I have watched it get adjusted a number of times as that cap has changed. So I have some thoughts of how it might be done, but I really don't know that. But other than that, the way you asked the question about how it would work would be the case that on January 2nd, as applications started coming in, they would be first come, first serve.
For complete applications that meet.
Correct. Yeah, they would be put in order as they got them. Say they get 5. All 5 of those will have in the first hour, they'll have a time in the first hour that they got them. And it might be one was 9:01 and 1 second, one was 9:01 and 2 seconds, but they'll have a time on them. And at first they'll take them just like that. But as they review them, what will happen is the ones that aren't complete applications will just get pulled out and tossed aside and sent back to the person and say, get back in line. So, you don't want to send something in just to hold a place, because if you forgot a signature, they're not going to toss it because of that. They're going to call you back and say, hey, we need your signature so this will be complete. But if it doesn't have the information where they can really review your project and understand completely what you're doing, then it will get rejected, and you will go to whenever you get it resubmitted, you won't get your place back in line. So it's important to make sure when you submit that, you feel comfortable that you have all the information you need to have in there. And again, if the tax credit passes, the State Historic Preservation Office can talk to you about your application prior to that. Now, please understand that, if this thing passes sometime and gets signed into law in December, they're probably going to push the timeline back and not start it in January. But if they start it in January, it's going to be kind of a nightmare because the State Historic Preservation Office doesn't have their system set up to review these tax credits the way they're going to want to do that. So it's going to be a little bit of confusion at first just to get, and so, don't give those guys a hard time, because, they're not going to get the help from the IT people they need to get a system set up, even if they went in today and say, hey, just in case this passes, we need to be prepared. The IT people are overwhelmed with other projects they've got to do. And they're like, yeah, you're going to have to wait because it's not even a real bill. So, there's only so much they can do. And, I don't know exactly how the process will work and how they'll put it together, but we'll have to go easy on them, because if it passes at the last minute, it's going to be a little bit of a headache for those guys.
Right. I think this is a good time to say, keep in tune with our social media and My Impact for updates about where the allocations kind of end up. And, when this passes, fingers crossed, we'll be helping disseminate this information in a similar form as this webinar and other ways to make sure everybody understands how to use the tax credit.
And Mallory, let me say this, if it hasn't been clear, is once one of these bills that's out there now is formally introduced, that bill will go on the miimpact.com webpage. So when the Senate Finance Committee meets, that's when we expect the bill that the Senate wants to introduce now to get introduced. And as soon as that happens, you will see that bill change on our site. So we're going to be prepared and ready to make sure the bill we can put out there is out there as soon as possible.
Yep, perfect. All right, we'll move on to the next question. When I'm collecting my stats to illustrate the good my project has done, is there a time frame in which I have to report them? For example, my project may not be fully leased within the first couple of months.
Oh, well, when you're putting those stats together, they're estimates. So, if you're leasing a building and, your intent is to have it leased up within a certain period of time, you can go ahead and put in the economic data that it's leased up. I mean, you can probably put a note on. I mean, we haven't seen the form, so I don't know how it's going to work. But I'm sure you can put a caveat on there. Once fully leased or something like that. But they're looking for the long term. What for the construction data and everything that goes with that. They're looking for actuals. It's there. This is what happened, because you should know that when you finish your project. That should not be a question. But as far as your forecast going forward, it's just that. It's a forecast. So, they know that you're just kind of giving them some numbers of what you think it might be. You don't want to give them numbers that aren't realistic, because that could come back to haunt you. But as long as you're doing something that makes sense, I don't think you'll have any problem with that. You just make some guesswork. Like, right now I'm 75% leased, but I'm thinking in 2 months I'll be fully leased. You make that prediction, you fill in the numbers with that caveat.
All right, perfect. Can projects be claimed retroactive since no bill was currently in place?
No. The only projects you can claim are projects that start on January 1st, 2021 or later. Unfortunately, you cannot go back and get anything before that. That's in the bill. And I probably should have said that. This was for projects that happen when the bill becomes law. So you can't go back and get that retroactively. There is absolutely no appetite to go back prior to this, because they consider this an economic stimulus bill. And if you could do your project without the stimulus, they don't want to give you the money. And I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but I also can understand where they're coming from. This is a tax credit for economic stimulus. If the project's going, we're not giving away that tax money.
Okay. And similar to this, but that will the tax credits be available to building projects that began in 2019 but aren't finished until 2020 or 2021?
No, because you were able to start your project. Therefore, you didn't need the stimulus to get it going in their mind. So it's only available for projects that start January 1st, 2021 or after.
Will this be a digital application or mail-in? And if a mail-in, won't that cause a possible conflict as to which application came in first?
I'm going to back up and say something about the last question, and I'm going to come back to this question.
Sure.
One of the things you may want to think of, you're doing a rehabilitation project now and you've already gotten started, is if you can find a way to have a distinct stop and a distinct start on January 1st, 2021, you may be able to work that, but it has to be distinct. It can't be like, oh yeah, I got half this building done, I'm just gonna do the other half. But say if up through the end of 2020, all you were doing was core and shell work, so you had done none of the tenant upfit that you need to do, then you could say, okay, my first phase was the core and shell, and I finished that before the tax credit was in place. Now I'm going to start the tenant upfit, and therefore I have a new project that I'm doing that I could not have done without the tax credit, because I didn't know how I was going to get to the tenant upfit. I was just worried about getting the core and shell done so people would want to be in my building. So, there's ways to play that game a little bit and maybe make something work. Going back to the question is, the intent is for it to be an electronic submission because of the time stamp needed. Because if it's a mail-in, I mean, you could live right next door to somebody and both put yours in the mail the same day, and somebody's get there 10 days before yours does. So that doesn't work real well. So the intent for it to be an online application. And my thought is that, and again, I don't know this, that they're going to actually put the application online where you fill it out online. But it may be when they first start out, they just have a place for you to upload the application to their system, because they don't have that actual fill in the blank system ready and available. Again, I don't work for the State Historic Preservation Office. I don't know how these things have come together, but I also know that, they haven't had a tax credit in a while, and they certainly have not had a tax credit since they've been working with, as far as a state tax credit, since they've been in the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, which has a whole different group of IT people than the Michigan State Housing Development Authority. So, I don't know that they know exactly how that'll come together. They obviously will have a better idea than me, but all those things will get ironed out and will get figured out, and we will obviously disseminate that information along with the State Historic Preservation Office as soon as we're able to do so.
Right. There's a point of clarification about how to check if your community has passed a resolution. And so I would direct everybody to the MI Impact website, and there's a list of all of the communities that have passed a resolution. And so you can double check to see if yours has passed one.
Yeah, it doesn't mean your community doesn't support it. Doesn't mean they haven't sent a letter, but they have not passed a resolution if it's not on that website, or at least they haven't shared it with us. And we're pretty sure that most communities that have passed a resolution have shared them with us.
Right. So in talking about resolutions from your communities, how do we get our community support if we don't actually know what's in the bills because they're constantly changing?
That's a pretty good question. You know, I think if it were me and I was doing this and you thought that was going to be a complication, I would take the bills that are on the MI Impact site, because they can go look that up on the state legislative page and read that bill. And that way you're telling them the same thing they can see if they're an elected official, if they go on and decide to do some research themselves. So, you know, all these things that are changing, I think you may want to say that we expect it to change a little bit, but here's basically what it's going to do. And it's basically going to do what those bills say, because, you know, having a cap is a change, but the bill's still the same. It's just now capped. Having the cap makes it first come, first serve, which is a change, but it's still a tax credit. The biggest change that's different is the difference in between being able to take the full 25% or having to take the 20% federal credit off that. And, you know, that does make a difference in what people will get. But if it's somebody that's not real familiar with the credit and how it works, and they're not familiar with the federal credit, it probably won't make a difference in whether they're willing to pass a resolution or not. So I would try not to get that complicated. I would use the ones that are out there now and say, yeah, we do expect it to change slightly, but these are the bills that are there, and it's going to be basically a tax credit bill like these.
In advocating and talking about advocacy, and we'll move back to the questions about the program itself. Is there anything in either of the bills things that an advocate should speak out against or suggest concern if they're talking with their legislator asking for their support?
Not really. I mean, I think it's fair to say when you're talking to your legislator that, you know, we really wish this credit was more than 7, especially when you're talking about the one that's the 7 and 65. I don't think you should complain about it all, because that's more than that's more than was ever taken in 1 year in the past with the tax credit. I don't think 65. I think 65 is very generous. But when you're looking at the 7 million, I think you can say that I really wish this tax credit was more. But I think you have to understand the position of the legislators and say, I really wish this was more. If there's any way to pump that up, I would love to see that. However, I understand the difficult position you're in with the budget that you have at this point, because, you know, who would want to be in their position? They're in a terrible position of having to decide who's going to get money, who's not going to get money, where the cuts are going to come from. So while you might mention it, I wouldn't complain very loudly. Other than that, I really don't know there's anything in the bill that I would be specifically concerned about. Now, I'm going to mention this, and I may wish I had not, but there is the potential that when this bill goes through the Senate Finance Committee, that there will be an amendment to put on the bill that says the property must be at least 100 years old to qualify for this tax credit. Right now, there is no specific year limit in the bill. However, it does insinuate that the building is 50 years old, because to be listed on any of the list, you have to be given special consideration and be exceptionally historically or architecturally important to get declared historic if you're not at least 50 years old. However, at this point, I would not go in and complain about that. I would not bring it up. However, should it get put on in the Senate Finance Committee that it has to be 100 years old for the building to qualify, that is something that we'd like to talk about to our legislators and our senators in particular when it goes to the Senate floor. Right now, getting people stirred up about that will do nothing to help it get through the Senate Finance Committee. We need to let it get through the Senate Finance Committee to see if it in fact does get that amendment on there. There's a possibility that it will. There's a possibility that it won't. We really don't know how that's going to turn out. And advocating either way right now is probably not helpful.
Would selling solar electricity from the roof of a church qualify the property as income producing?
I have to be honest. That's a question that would probably have to be asked of the Attorney General's office if and when the tax credit passes, because that is a stretch. However, I'm not saying it doesn't qualify. I think that's going to, the state's lawyers are going to have to interpret that, because that's kind of iffy.
Okay. Does an application, the question is for 2020, but since we don't have it now, I'm going to bump it to 2021. So does an application for 2021 submitted in 2021 put the project in line for 2021 or 2022? I guess, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. If they're asking if they applied this year because things were passed, would that put it in line for 2021?
Right. Well, again, they're not going to take any applications until 2021. But in 2021, if you apply for a tax credit and they've used up all the money under the cap, so there is no money for your tax credit, you get put in line in order that you applied for 2022. So might you get a tax credit in 2022? Yes, but it's determined by where you fall in that order. So say the first, I'll make up a number, 25 projects that were in line from 2021 as we go to 2022 can take tax credits, then those 25 will get it. And if you're 26, you won't get it in 2022. It just depends on where you fall in that order, but they will keep you in the same order for the next year for a tax credit. They will hold you in that order for 2 years. So if you put an application in 2021, that application will be good if it doesn't get it in 2021 for 2022. If it doesn't get it in 2022, it'll be good for 2023. When you get to 2024, you'd have to resubmit.
Okay, thank you. And if that was your question and I misinterpreted what you were trying to ask, do pre-ask the question again, apologies. Can you move forward with your part 2 and have that approved if during your part 1, your property had only been found eligible for designation, i.e. your community is taking time to pass the local protective ordinance, but when it is your property would be deemed contributing?
Unfortunately, unlike the federal credit, which if you're deemed eligible for the National Register, you are eligible to go ahead and apply for the credit. You just can't take the credit until you're listed. Unfortunately, the state is not set up that way. You have to be listed somehow and get past the part 1, or you're not eligible. So just keep that in mind. If you're wanting to get your project done, you have to go through the listing process first. That's unfortunate, but that's just where we are at this point. That may be something we can look into for future tweaks to the bill. It's not going to happen with this one.
Okay, all right. So post COVID-19, what is the status of the CRP program and its application?
I know that they're still taking applications, but what I don't know is how they're reviewing them and how they're giving out the money. My assumption is they're probably being very careful at committing money that they don't know they can give out at this point, because they really just don't know how much money is going to be there and how that's going to play out. But unfortunately, I don't really know the answer to your question. I just know that they're very, very concerned about making commitments to people that they can't follow through on.
Right. And Mark, can you just say what the CRP program is for those who may not be familiar with the acronym?
Yes, this Community Revitalization Program, which is part of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, and it does give out grants and loans to historic preservation projects as well as other community development projects across the state. If you go to the Michigan Economic Development Corporation website, they have a complete description on there that tells you what they fund and how you can apply for those grants.
Okay, thank you. Just in case.
Now, one question that I think had seen scroll across the state, or the chat earlier, is that how does the tax credit program, if it passes, affect the CRP program? There is no correlation between those right now, and unless something changes, there's nothing that says you can't apply for a tax credit and also for a grant or loan from CRP. I can't tell you they won't look at changing that at some point in the future, but there's nothing in either legislation that would require that to be the case.
All right, thank you. So that is all of the questions. We have made it through. We had over 20 questions. So thank you all for your engaging conversation. I hope this was really helpful for everybody. Mark, do you have any wrapping up comments to share?
Well, I just want to say that, the tax credit itself is not dead. If you have not talked to your legislator in a long time about this, call them, write them, email them saying, this is a great economic stimulus. We hope you'll consider this legislation even during the times that we have now, even with your difficult budget, because this will make a difference in our community. So I would definitely put the effort into contacting people because, their mind's not on this unless you're contacting. Now, I can tell you that both the Michigan Historic Preservation Network and the Cultural Advocacy Network of Michigan have been having Zoom meetings with the legislators, and we've been talking about the tax credits. So they're hearing about it, but it's much more important for them to hear about this from you than it is from us. So if you haven't contacted your legislature, please do that. You mentioned the MI Impact website. I wanted to mention the MichiganHistoricPreservation.org website. Mallory mentioned it first, but I want to mention that again, because if you get MI Impact, you don't know what it is, go to our website. There's a direct link there to the MI Impact website that will get you that information. And there's also other good information on our website about things we're doing, programs that we have, and the great webinars that Mallory's putting together.
All right.
Thank you all for your time. We appreciate you being here and joining us. Appreciate your support for the Historic Preservation Tax Credit.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all again for attending, and look for a link to this recording in your inbox as soon as we can get it processed. We will also be providing a PDF version of Mark's presentation for you to refer to as well. Thank you all, and we hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you.